I don't know that I'm going to be able to match the enthusiasm that we just saw in that last video. That was really, really cool to see. Up here to give a policy talk, a talk about governance, a talk about regulatory development and how it can all support the type of innovation that we're seeing in the sector today. So Secure World Foundation, very briefly, for those of you who may not know us, we are, as Ariane said, a nonprofit based in the US. We look broadly at topics related to what we call space sustainability. Essentially, how do we address in a cooperative manner the challenges that affect our community's ability to continue to operate in and benefit from the space environment. So we've heard, excuse me, we've heard throughout this conference about the way in which commercial innovation is driving activity in the space sector today. That innovation is challenging the policy and governance frameworks that exist to be able to evolve more effectively, efficiently, and responsively to be able to support and enable that concurrent commercial development. Yesterday, we heard from Eric and Greg and Kelvin and others about how the US government is taking a very systematic steps to adapt our regulatory environment here in the US to take into account these developments. What I want to do with this talk today is talk a little bit about how we need to have new models for collaboration and coordination at the multilateral level to address these changes. But first, I want to talk about escalators. So imagine yourself, you're in a crowded train station. Everybody is competing for space, competing to get to where they're going. Some people are very familiar with this train station. Others may be the first time there. You come to an elevator, or an escalator, excuse me. How do you know which side you're supposed to stand on? How do you know which side you're supposed to walk up? Just keep that in mind. As my introduction said, I'm a reformed consultant. I like to start with data. So what's going on in the space sector today? This is data from the Union of Concerned Scientists. They maintain a satellite database, essentially snapshots of the number of operating satellites on orbit at any given time, showing about a 10-year trend here. When I look at this data, I don't see so much as a tipping point as an inflection point or two. We've clearly reached a point where there are an increasing number of satellites and objects in orbit, and a trend that is increasing and not likely to change. So starting from about 800 satellites in orbit about 10 years ago to approximately 1,900 in the current estimate. And as we all know, forecasts of very large constellations to launch in the coming years, it doesn't seem like this trend is likely to change. So what we see here is a more complex operating domain than what we've had in the past. We see more users, more interactions, and more applications that emerge out of that. It brings a number of challenges. It brings coordination of the large constellations, increased potential collision risk, increased use of CubeSats. How do we track those? How do we deal with them at the end of their life? Increased need for interoperator coordination, and an increased number of actors, both from a finance and from an operations sense, coming into the space sector who may not necessarily have the existing knowledge about how existing best practices and existing operational approaches are used. So these challenges require cooperative governance solutions and approaches. Looking a little bit more deeply into this environment of change, we can see a second set of change, and that's a shift in the nature of who's operating those satellites. So this is data from Jonathan McDowell's satellite catalog. He's with, I believe, the Harvard Center for Astrophysics maintains a very useful kind of tracking site. And what we see here is a tabulation of the share of satellites launched by operator type in each decade from the beginning of the space age. So in red, you have, I believe, that's remember what colors are which. So red, I believe, is civil government, and blue is military government. They have that backwards. Anyway, in the early phases, 1950s, 60s, 70s, you see a very clearly governmental-driven domain. As we get into the 1990s and today, you see a multi-user domain. We have commercial actors emerging, we have amateur and academic actors emerging, and the share of government satellites is decreasing as a percentage. In the words of a presentation I saw at the IAC last week from the United Kingdom Space Agency, this commercial sector, this private sector activity is signifying a rapidly evolving, technologically rich and multidisciplinary sector. That entails competition, that entails innovation, it entails new types of services and benefits from space systems, and it entails increasing pressure on the importance of maintaining stability in that operating domain in light of increasing number and diversity of actors. This shift, for a long time, the actors, or the entities making the rules, the governments, were also the actors most affected by those rules. They were operating the majority of the satellites. Today, that shift is changing. That shift has changed. While governments are still a key role in making the rules, those rules are increasingly affected or impactful on a commercial domain. Suggests a need to improve or ways to adapt governance systems to include that shift. With the remaining time in the talk here, I want to take you through some initiatives my organization is involved in, along with a host of partners, looking at how to facilitate that shift, looking at how to bring increased private sector cooperation and coordination into the multilateral governance discussions. So one place that we like to start is making sure that the sector has a existing knowledge base, and that knowledge base is documented. So if you're a new actor, a new government, a new private sector, a new university, coming into the space operations environment, do you have an existing familiarity with common approaches, best practice, and the way things are done? We've published about a year and a half ago what we call a Handbook for New Space Actors. This has 3 chapters. The first chapter starts with an overview of the existing international treaty system and the ways in which space issues are coordinated and governed at the international level. We then, in the second chapter, look at what that means for regulatory and policy systems at the domestic national level. And the third chapter looks at best practice in space operations. And the idea here is to provide a resource that new entrants can access and use to kind of familiarize themselves with how things are done in this sector. We found a wide range of uses for this, a number of things that we didn't expect, including finding investors coming in from outside of the space sector that find this kind of product very useful to really understand what they're getting themselves into. But, learn the buttons on the remote. But as we know, we have a number of novel, non-traditional commercial space applications that are emerging these days that don't necessarily fully reflect an existing best practice. One of these first new areas was that attracted considerable attention was space resources development, or colloquially asteroid mining. A number of startups, primarily in the US, have advanced business plans to commercially access lunar and asteroidal resources, primarily in the near term for developing in situ resource utilization and fuel manufacturing. As these startups emerged, as their business plans became financed and more credible, nations, in particular the US and Luxembourg, responded with domestic law to provide licensing and authorization, responding to international obligations under the Outer Space Treaty to provide authorization and supervision regimes for their space actors. The space resources development and the emergence of this as a commercial area of activity attracted a considerable amount of attention at the international level. Concerns about how this novel new application related to provisions in the Outer Space Treaty and other international instruments of international law, which were essentially vague on the point of whether this type of activity was permitted. In the interest of developing a constructive policy approach or legal approach to enabling this industry, my organization partnered with a host of other academic, government, and industry partners across the globe to establish what we refer to as the Hague Space Resources Governance Working Group. This group, over the last 2 years, has published a set of 19 policy building blocks that we hope will be a coordination factor at the international level to help governments understand how the best approach to setting up an enabling legal regime for space research development might occur. But what I mentioned is this is a process that was an informal process. It was outside of the formal multilateral bodies, but we had participants from several governments, we had participants from several of the startups, and we had participants from several different academic institutions. And it really showed the value of sharing information, building confidence, and building the relationships to help governments, help new actors understand the real likely development pathway for this new application. Another application we've heard talked about at this conference is on-orbit satellite servicing. This is a fundamental cornerstone capability to enable a whole host of new applications and development in the space sector that will broadly enable us to do a whole host of new beneficial activities. At the international level, there are some concerns about the development of this activity, including potential dual use concerns, including potential how interactions between spacecrafts on orbit might increase risk of debris and incur liability obligations for the national governments. My organization, along with 3 other organizations, is working under a DARPA-supported contract to facilitate the development of industry consensus standards for on-orbit servicing under a program known as the Consortium for Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing Operations, or CONFERS. So what we are aiming to do with CONFERS, and we have an international group of companies that are participating, is to develop a set of best practice and principles for responsible on-orbit servicing operations and how those operations can be done in a way that mitigates third-party risk, and then to move from there into technical standards to provide a foundational framework for a growing industry. Again, this is another example of a process where industry is collaborating, developing best practice, and then using that to inform relationships and development with government. For those of you who are in the Washington, D.C. area, on November 8th, we'll be having the first public global satellite servicing forum, a large conference to discuss all market, technology, and business developments related to satellite servicing. Collectively, so talking in the last couple of slides about 2 specific initiatives, looking at specific novel applications. Broadly, we see another trend, and that is the development of normative principles and guidelines where actors collectively sit together and agree on a set of voluntary commitments that will guide how they develop responsible activities, and it will guide how they develop potential policy implementation. So a couple of these to highlight. In June of this year, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space agreed to 21 guidelines for the long-term sustainability of space activities. This is a multi-year negotiation process that resulted in 21 guidelines to help protect and ensure space sustainability, agreed to in a consensus matter by, I believe the committee has 88 member states at the moment. So these are very high-level documents, or high-level commitments or guidelines. They discuss policy, regulatory, technical, and coordination matters, but they have a coordination framework. There are ideas that national governments can then take to implement at the regulatory level, and they can take to industry and implement at operations level. Parallel to that, in the industry sector, the Global VSAT Forum, which is a trade association based here in the US composed of satellite operators and ground segment vendors, has been facilitating a process over the last year to develop an industry commitment to best practice for sustainable space operations, looking at the large constellations, looking at the CubeSats, looking at the geo environment, and looking at how all these new applications can coordinate in that more complex environment to operate responsibly, to demonstrate confidence. So these 2 initiatives are an example of coordination to develop non-binding but yet important guideline activities. And just last week at the International Astronautical Congress, the World Economic Forum, so a global organization promoted focus on economic development, announced an initiative that's developing to develop a space sustainability rating index. So it will look at some of these best practices, look at some of these guidelines, and actually rate performance. So back to the escalators. So the picture I started with, the one picture was from Osaka, the other picture was Tokyo. In Tokyo, you walk, you stand on the left, walk on the right. Osaka, you stand on the right, walk on the left. This is an example of a norm. It's a non-binding yet widely recognized social means for enforcing behavior. If you walk on the wrong side of the escalator, chances are you're going to know that you're not performing to your responsible obligation. Norms are becoming an increasingly important part of the space governance architecture. They provide means for coordination between multi-sector interests in developing them. They provide a non-binding way to implement, and they provide a way to inform regulation and inform policy. It's going to be more important as this sector becomes more complex, more commercially driven, and more innovative, that norms of behavior become an increasingly significant way in which we organize ourselves and approach governance of challenges. So 9 seconds before break, thank you, and happy to talk to you out in the hall.